The words hit like a hammer, echoing in the silent room long after they left his mouth. "You're just not classy enough for me." I froze, the fork halfway to my mouth, the perfectly prepared anniversary dinner suddenly tasting like ashes. 5 years. 5 years of marriage. 5 years of laughter, arguments, shared dreams, and all of it reduced to a casual judgment, spat out like a line from a cruel script. He leaned back in his chair, swirling his wine glass with that irritating air of superiority. The kind of superiority that only comes from wealth, privilege, and an inflated sense of taste. I looked at him, the man I once adored, the man I thought would be my partner in life, and I barely recognized him. The warm smiles, the teasing joke, the late-night conversations about our dreams, they had vanished. In their place was a man obsessed with appearances, with status, with the idea of being seen as better than everyone else. And tonight, apparently, I wasn't good enough. My hands trembled, but not from fear. It was a strange mixture of humiliation, anger, and the faintest spark of determination. I had always known he could be condescending, but this was deliberate, cruel, calculated. He wanted to make me feel small, invisible, replaceable, and for a fleeting moment I almost did. I tried to smile. I really did. "Classy enough for what?" I asked, voice calm but shaky. He just looked at me, the corner of his mouth curling into a smirk, eyes glittering with amusement at my confusion. "You know," he said, slowly, as if explaining a simple concept to a child. "For our life, the circles I move in, the people I entertain, you don't fit." I wanted to scream, to throw the wine glass, to tell him that love and effort outweighed any label or dress code. But I didn't. I held back, forcing a polite smile, masking the storm that had ignited inside me. He had underestimated me, and that mistake was about to become the first domino in a carefully plotted plan. The next few days were a haze of reflection. I replayed his words over and over, dissecting every syllable, every inflection, every subtle jab. He thought he was cruel, but what he didn't realize was that cruelty could be a catalyst. It could ignite a fire where before there was only compliance. I realized, with a clarity that both frightened and thrilled me, that I could no longer let anyone define my worth, not even the person who was supposed to be my partner for life. And so, I began, quietly, meticulously, deliberately. By day, I maintained the role he expected, obedient, compliant, unassuming. I smiled when he sneered, nodded when he criticized, and never challenged his authority in our home. He believed I was the same ordinary woman he had always dismissed. That belief was my advantage. By night, my world transformed. I pored over financial articles, legal documents, and investment strategies. I enrolled in online courses about wealth management, corporate law, and personal finance. Each night became a laboratory, a place where I could experiment, plan, and strategize without interference. I was building a life he could never imagine, a life he would never see coming. I also rebuilt my self-image. It wasn't about appeasing him. It was about proving to myself that I mattered. I exercised, learned posture and etiquette, and polished every aspect of my presentation. Not for him, but for me. My confidence, previously overshadowed by his scorn, began to bloom quietly, imperceptibly, like a flower growing through cracks in the pavement. The plan wasn't impulsive. It was calculated. First, financial independence. I opened hidden accounts, made smart, discreet investments, and began quietly amassing a portfolio that would secure my autonomy. He assumed I had no grasp of money, no understanding of the world outside his narrow lens. He was wrong. Every transfer, every stock purchase, every legal consultation was a brick in the fortress I was building, a fortress he could not breach. Second, legal preparedness. I reached out to top-tier lawyers, establishing relationships without ever revealing my intentions. I studied contracts, divorce law, and asset protection strategies. I needed everything airtight, beyond challenge, and perfectly timed. When the day came to act, there would be no loopholes, no delays, no room for his charm or arrogance to manipulate the outcome. Meanwhile, I kept close tabs on him, not out of obsession, but strategy. I noted his routines, his weaknesses, his pride. Every word he spoke, every interaction he had, was a piece of a puzzle I was assembling. I realized he measured everyone by the same shallow standard he had applied to me. He assumed appearances and wealth dictated value. But value, I was learning, could be created quietly, strategically, and without fanfare. And through it all, the anger remained. Not a burning, chaotic fire, but a slow, patient flame, constant and steady. It was the kind of anger that transforms humiliation into action. Every insult, every dismissive comment, every moment he believed he was controlling me only fueled my resolve. He had set the stage, unknowingly, for my transformation. By the end of the first year, I was no longer the woman he had dismissed. My investments were growing, my legal strategy was in place, and my confidence radiated in ways he could not measure. I had built a double life, the obedient, underestimated wife by day, and the cunning, unstoppable strategist by night. And I knew the day would come when the roles would reverse, when the paper he had dismissed as inconsequential would carry more weight than any sneer or insult, when the woman he had laughed at would command respect, authority, and power in ways he could never anticipate. I smiled to myself in the mirror one night, the reflection of determination staring back at me. He had said I wasn't classy enough. He had laughed, dismissed, and belittled me, but he had no idea. Class wasn't about appearances. Class was about strategy, patience, and the ability to rise while others underestimated you. And rise, I would. The days blurred into a carefully orchestrated routine. By sunlight, I played the obedient wife, the picture of domestic compliance. I smiled when he critiqued the dinner, laughed at his jokes even when they bit, and nodded to every dismissive comment, absorbing the humiliation like water seeping into stone. Little did he know, the real work began the moment the sun dipped below the horizon. Night after night, I transformed my small study into a command center. Laptops hummed, spreadsheets glowed, and legal documents stacked high, forming towers of ambition I kept meticulously organized. I had learned early that chaos could be disguised as normalcy. While he sipped wine and scrolled through social media, I was mapping investments, reading financial reports, and contacting discreet legal advisors. Every action I took was invisible, but deliberate, building a foundation for a life he couldn't control. I began small, a modest investment in a tech startup, chosen after nights of obsessive research and comparisons. Every decision was calculated, every risk measured. I wasn't just trying to make money, I was trying to build power, independence, and leverage. He assumed I had no interest in finances, no understanding of the business world. That assumption was my secret weapon. Each month, my portfolio grew quietly, imperceptibly, until the numbers were no longer modest, they were formidable. Simultaneously, I immersed myself in legal strategy. I studied divorce law, asset protection, and contract clauses like they were sacred texts. I consulted with attorneys, asking questions under the guise of curiosity, never revealing my ultimate plan. Each new piece of knowledge, each carefully filed document, became a tool I could wield when the time was right. I imagined the moment when the roles would reverse, and his smug superiority would crumble in the face of my meticulous preparation. But money and law weren't enough. I needed influence, a network, and the appearance of respectability that no one could question. I attended networking events disguised as casual social outings, asked questions, listened more than I spoke, and learned the language of business power. I observed CEOs, investors, and entrepreneurs, their patterns, their habits, the way they projected authority. Every encounter was data, every detail stored in my mind for later use. Meanwhile, my home life remained the stage he expected. I folded laundry with a serene smile, hosted dinner parties with laughter that masked the plotting behind my eyes, and maintained the illusion of ordinariness. He never suspected that while I prepared his meals and obeyed his rules, I was quietly building an empire that would one day make him irrelevant. It was exhilarating. The thrill of secrecy, the satisfaction of control, was finally the protagonist of my own story. Months turned into a year, and the empire I was constructing began to take tangible shape. I launched a small consultancy under a pseudonym, providing advice and capital to select startups. Every investment was strategic, every business carefully vetted. I focused on sectors he would never have imagined I could navigate: logistics and emerging markets. The consultancy grew, not in noise or publicity, but in quiet influence and significant profit. By night, I was a strategist, an investor, a visionary. By day, I remained unseen, underestimated, dismissed. The psychological shift was profound. Every insult he had hurled, every sneer at my appearance, fueled my determination. The more he tried to belittle me, the more I poured into my secret empire. His contempt became my motivation, his arrogance my blueprint. I realized that power wasn't about public recognition. It was about leverage, timing, and execution. By the time he noticed my growing independence, the foundation of my empire would be unassailable. I also honed my personal brand in subtle ways. I upgraded my wardrobe, not to impress him, but to exude confidence in meetings and presentations he would never see. I learned the art of negotiation, the science of persuasion, and the discipline of patience. Each night, I documented progress meticulously: spreadsheets, contracts, memos, and projections. Every detail mattered. Every record was a weapon, every investment a step closer to freedom. And then came the pivotal moment. A startup I had nurtured under my consultancy achieved massive success. Overnight, my influence expanded, my financial independence skyrocketed, and the very foundation of my life with him began to shift. He remained oblivious, believing that I was still confined to the domestic cage he had built. Little did he know, the woman he dismissed as ordinary was now the invisible force behind a company making headlines in the business world. By the end of the second year, my empire was no longer secret in effect, it was formidable in impact. Revenue streams multiplied, my consultancy became sought after, and I had connections with key figures in the industries I targeted. Yet I remained hidden in plain sight, a ghost in my own home, quietly laughing at the irony of it all. The man who had declared me unworthy had no idea that every decision he made, every word he had spoken, had directly contributed to my rise. The night I finalized the acquisition of a major partner company, I allowed myself a private smile in the dark of my office. The document glowed on my laptop screen, the numbers undeniable, the signatures binding. I was free, empowered, and unstoppable. All those nights of silent planning, all the sacrifices, the exhaustion, the careful patience, it had culminated in this moment. I leaned back, letting the weight of what I had accomplished sink in. My secret empire was not just wealth, it was autonomy, respect, and the knowledge that I had turned humiliation into triumph. He had underestimated me, mocked me, and tried to control me, but he had failed spectacularly. The power dynamic had shifted, and I held all the cards, and I knew the final act would be devastatingly precise. One day he would discover the truth, not through gossip, not by accident, but through undeniable evidence: the contracts, the ownership, the empire that bore my name. And when that moment came, he would finally see the woman he had dismissed, not as ordinary, but as unstoppable. It started with a meeting he could never attend, a gathering he would never suspect existed. I walked into the boardroom that morning, not as the wife he believed he controlled, but as the lead investor and founder of a company that had quietly reshaped an entire industry. The room hummed with anticipation, the executives unaware of the storm about to break. I smiled politely, took my seat at the head of the table, and listened as the financial reports were presented. Each graph, each revenue projection reflected months of careful strategy, calculated risk, and sleepless nights. I had built this empire piece by piece, invisible yet indomitable. The weight of it, the sheer power in my hands, was intoxicating. I was no longer just a figure in my husband's house. I was a force in the business world, a name that commanded attention and respect, and he had no idea. Meanwhile, at home, he went about his daily life, blissfully ignorant. He assumed I spent my evenings knitting, reading romance novels, or hosting trivial social gatherings. He believed I had no ambition beyond our small domestic world, no capacity for enterprise, no hidden reservoirs of skill or tenacity. That misconception was my shield. He had underestimated me for years, and every night I spent working in secret only strengthened the fortress I was building around my freedom and power. Then came the first moment of confrontation, the one I had been planning meticulously for months. A routine business update, an invitation to a gala where the industry's most influential figures would be present. I agreed to attend, knowing that my husband's curiosity would eventually lead him there. I arrived at the event dressed elegantly but understated, my presence commanding attention without screaming for it. The whispers began immediately. People recognized me, or at least recognized the name attached to my company. Some offered congratulations, some asked questions, but all eyes acknowledged that I was no longer the woman they could ignore. And then, he arrived. My husband, oblivious to the magnitude of what I had achieved, stepped into the room with that same smug expression, believing he had the social upper hand. He moved through the crowd with ease, shaking hands, exchanging pleasantries, entirely unaware that the very woman he had dismissed was about to redefine the narrative entirely. I spotted him from across the room and allowed myself a private smile. The moment was approaching, the revelation I had orchestrated with precision. I waited until the peak of the gala, when the crowd was thick, the champagne flowing, and the energy at its highest. Then, casually, I approached him, handing over the gala program with a polite, almost deferential smile. He glanced at it, his eyes scanning the list of prominent sponsors and investors. That's when his expression changed. At first, confusion, a flicker of recognition that quickly gave way to disbelief, and then, finally, horror. My name was listed as the principal investor and founder of several key ventures, including the one that had single-handedly transformed the very industry he prided himself on understanding. You, he stammered, the single word barely escaping his lips. His voice was unsteady, faltering under the weight of realization. The room seemed to shrink around him as eyes turned, curious at the sudden tension. He had dismissed me for years, belittled my ambitions, and assumed I was incapable. And now, in a single moment, all his assumptions crumbled. I smiled gently, letting the silence stretch just long enough for the impact to sink in. I said, calmly, almost softly, "That's me." I didn't need to explain further. The documents, the contract, the financial statements all spoke for themselves. The empire I had built in secret was now undeniable, a fortress of success he could no longer ignore or belittle. Around him, people began to murmur. Some leaned in to confirm, others exchanged glances, and the air was thick with astonishment. My husband's face, once so full of control and arrogance, drained of color. Every gesture, every word, every smug expression had evaporated in the face of undeniable truth. He realized, painfully, that the woman he had tried to confine and diminish had surpassed him in every measurable way. "What? How?" he asked, voice barely audible over the whispers. "I didn't know." "You didn't look," I said, calm and measured. "You assumed, you judged, you dismissed me. And I allowed you to, because I was planning for a moment like this." My tone carried no malice, only the quiet authority of someone who had been underestimated for far too long. He opened his mouth again, but I raised a hand, stopping him. "Save it. You don't get to lecture me on class or capability anymore. That chapter ended years ago. What you see now is the result of patience, strategy, and action, qualities you claimed I lacked." The crowd was silent, hanging on every word. I could feel the weight of their attention, the shift in power, and the sweet satisfaction of justice finally unfolding. And then, with the precision I had planned, I handed him the final piece, a copy of the legal documents showing my ownership and controlling interest in the company. His hands trembled as he took them, his eyes scanning the pages in disbelief. Each line, each signature, each clause was a nail in the coffin of his arrogance. I watched him struggle to reconcile the woman he had underestimated with the powerhouse standing before him. This can't be real," he whispered, voice barely audible, his pride crumbling like fragile glass. He looked up at me, searching for some hint that this was a mistake, some loophole he could exploit. But there was none. The empire was mine, and he could do nothing to undo it. I leaned in slightly, my voice steady and unwavering. It's very real, and it's only the beginning. I didn't build this to prove a point to anyone else. I built it for me. But if you need a lesson in what happens when someone underestimates you, consider this your wake-up call. The room remained silent for a moment longer, then erupted into polite applause from the attendees who had witnessed the scene. Conversations buzzed, eyes darting between us, the shift in power impossible to ignore. My husband, once the dominant figure in my life, was now the humbled observer. And as I walked away, head held high, I felt a sense of liberation that no victory could match. The humiliation of the past, the years of dismissal and condescension, were finally eclipsed by undeniable proof of my worth. I had transformed every insult into fuel, every doubt into strategy, and every underestimate into an empire. For the first time in years, I felt completely free. Not just financially, not just strategically, but emotionally. I had reclaimed my life, my power, and my dignity. And my husband, well, he would never look at me the same way again. The days after the revelation were a whirlwind. Everywhere I went, whispers followed me. Not of gossip, but of respect, admiration, and awe. The empire I had quietly built in the shadows now stood in broad daylight, impossible to ignore. Executives, investors, and even former skeptics reached out, eager to collaborate, to learn, or simply to acknowledge the woman who had defied every expectation. And through it all, I carried myself with the calm assurance of someone who had long anticipated this moment. At home, the atmosphere was tense, an invisible weight hanging over every interaction. My husband moved with the caution of a man navigating unfamiliar terrain. He no longer issued commands with the same arrogance, no longer questioned my choices with the familiar smirk. The house, once a stage where I played the obedient, underestimated wife, had become a silent arena of subtle power. Every word he spoke now seemed measured, every glance hesitant, because he knew he had been unmasked. Yet I did not gloat. Triumph, I had learned, was most potent when wielded with precision and restraint. My goal had never been revenge in the petty sense. It had been freedom, respect, and proof of my own capability. Still, the small victories were undeniably satisfying. Watching him realize, day after day, that the woman he dismissed now controlled vast wealth and influence was a quiet, sweet form of justice. My empire continued to grow. The consultancy I had started in secret expanded into new sectors, attracting top talent, influential partners, and strategic alliances. Each success was a testament to the years of sacrifice, the nights of tireless work, and the meticulous planning I had invested. What once seemed impossible, a life where I was both independent and powerful, had become my everyday reality. I moved with confidence in meetings, negotiations, and social circles. The I name that once drew laughter or dismissal now commanded attention and respect. The ultimate test came months later, in a board meeting where my husband had been invited purely as a spectator. The company he had once seen as mine in name only, while he believed he understood my ambitions, was now thriving under my guidance. I presented the latest quarterly results, growth projections, and new strategic initiatives. The room responded with nods, questions, and applause. My husband sat at the edge, pale and silent, no longer the dominant figure he once believed himself to be. It was then that I decided to draw the final line. I approached him after the meeting, handing over a folder with a single sentence written on the first page: divorce papers, signed by a Forbes-listed attorney. His hands trembled as he took it, his eyes scanning the document. The irony was delicious. He had insisted I remain under his control, that I could never balance ambition with domestic life, that I was incapable of standing on my own. Now, faced with undeniable proof, he realized the extent of his underestimation. "I suppose congratulations are in order," he muttered, voice barely above a whisper, his pride completely shattered. I smiled, calm and resolute. "No congratulations necessary. This isn't about you. It's about me. My life, my independence, and my choices. The empire was always mine to build, and the freedom always mine to claim. The legal proceedings were swift, professional, and final. He had no leverage, no authority, and no recourse. Every claim he might have made had been anticipated, countered, and neutralized with careful planning. The divorce, finalized in my favor, was not just a legal victory, it was a symbolic one, an undeniable testament to years of silent determination and strategy. As I walked out of the courthouse, the crisp air felt like liberation. No longer bound by the constraints of his expectations, no longer limited by the judgment of a man who had refused to see my worth, I stepped into the world on my own terms. The empire I had built, the respect I had earned, and the freedom I had claimed, all of it was mine. And it was glorious. Friends, colleagues, and new allies celebrated not just the financial success, but the story itself. The tale of a woman underestimated, dismissed, and confined, who had transformed every insult and every restriction into the fuel for greatness. Interviews, articles, and profiles followed, each emphasizing not just the wealth and influence, but the strategy, intelligence, and unwavering resolve that had brought me there. And yet, the most satisfying moment was private. It came when I returned to my office late one night, the city lights glimmering outside the window. I sat at my desk, reviewing the contracts and report, and allowed myself a moment of reflection. I remembered every scoff, every dismissive glance, every word he had used to diminish me. Each one had been a spark, igniting the fire that had driven me to build this empire. And now, that fire had become a force the world could not ignore. I realized finally that true power isn't loud or boastful. It's quiet, strategic, and relentless. It's the patience to plan, the discipline to execute, and the wisdom to wait for the perfect moment. I had transformed every limitation into an advantage, every doubt into a stepping stone, every insult into a strategy. And in doing so, I had claimed something far greater than revenge. I had claimed my life on my terms. The story of the woman who was once dismissed as ordinary, confined, and incapable had become legend. Not because I flaunted wealth or status, but because I had taken control of my destiny and refused to be defined by anyone else's standard. My empire, built in the shadows, had become a beacon of resilience, determination, and intelligence. And the man who had tried to control me? He would never forget the woman he had underestimated. Because in the end, I had done more than succeed. I had transformed my life into a narrative of empowerment, proving that the strongest form of triumph isn't revenge, but the creation of something lasting, meaningful, and unstoppable. The empire at night had become a legacy in the light of day, and nothing could take it from me.